This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to take a look at the union statement, the except, and the intersect in SQL Server. We will not be looking at the union statement, the intersect, or the except. The except doesn't exist within Oracle. Instead of using the except, you would have to use the minus. But the intersect and the union statement essentially work the same way in Oracle that they do in SQL Server. And in our Oracle schema, we really don't have any conditions that really fit a union statement very well. We could make up something, but it just wouldn't be that beneficial to do a union statement on. So we're going to essentially go through what it's like in SQL Server and just know that you can apply pretty much the same thing except for the except clause, and we'll point out that it is minus in Oracle when we get to that point. But we're going to start with union statements. And this is essentially where we can take two queries and pretty much combine the results. And then if we need to reorder the results by a field or more than one fields from within the select statements, we can do that. Now, each of the queries has to return the same number of columns, and each of the columns has to be the same data type that's returned between the two queries in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and let's switch over to SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to look at AdventureWorks, and we have good options here with our transaction history archive and our transaction history. So we're going to look at our transaction history first. And if I just do a select asterisk from my production.transaction history, it's going to show me the columns that are out here. I have a transaction ID, I have a product ID, reference order ID, reference order line ID, and the transaction date, transaction type, quantity, actual cost, and modified date. Now, when we go through here, we're probably going to use the transaction ID, the product ID, the reference order ID, the reference order line ID, and then the transaction date. If we change our query here and essentially copy and paste it, because we'll be using it again, we're just doing a short form right now. This is going to be from our transaction history archive. So I'm going to add the archive to the end of this. When I execute this, I can still see that I have my transaction ID, product ID, reference order ID, reference order line ID, and then the transaction date. So we have some of these same fields across. We could bring in the transaction type and the quantity, etc., but we're just going to limit a few of the fields here. Now I'm going to structure this in a normal query format between the two tables, and I'm going to join these two tables using a union statement, but I have to get my field list out. And this is going to be essentially where I'm selecting the transaction ID, product ID, the reference order ID, reference order line ID, and then also the transaction date. Selecting the same fields between the tables. So I'm going to go ahead and add this and order this by the transaction date in descending order, followed by the transaction ID. When I execute this statement, I get 202,696 rows returned from that query. Quite a few rows. One of the things that I don't know as I scroll through here is which table I retrieve the data from. So one of the things I could do is I could add a new parameter to each of the queries. In this case, I'm going to change the 1 to be archive and the one to be history. So this is going to be history, and I'm going to alias this as trans type. Come down and add this as archive as trans type. They both are going to be varchar, and essentially then I can run this, and at least as I scroll through here I can see history, 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 history. At some point I should see my records that are going to be in archive. You scroll down faster here. There we have our archive records. So in this case, we are joining the query from the history table with the query information from the transaction ID. In a lot of cases, we might have log files and history files for our log files that we would want to combine the results together and look at a consolidated view of that information, similar to what we did with the transaction history and the transaction history archive. Now, as we go back, we have two additional things that we can do. We can change out our union statement to be an except. And for Oracle, this is not supported, but a minus is supported. So you would change the except to minus and it would work similarly there. Now, when we come back, what a minus is going to do is it's going to return us the distinct rows from the left input query that aren't output by the right input query. So if we look at that, when we're doing our select statements with the union, and this is going to be our left table, it's essentially just going to return this information if we do the except. So I can go ahead and I can execute this, and I'm essentially getting the 113,443 rows. If I did a select count, we haven't learned how to do this yet, but next week or the week after we will. This is going to be from the production. I'm just going to copy this here. If we take a look at those rows, we have 113,443. That's the number of rows that we were returned from that except. The next thing that we want to do, thinking about the way that we deal with history and archive and stuff, if we have something in the history, we wouldn't expect it to be in the archive. When we move from history to archive, we would essentially remove it from the history and move it over to the archive, so it would only exist in the archive and not in the history after the move. So we would not necessarily expect that we're going to have output from both that are distinct rows. So in this case, if I would go ahead and execute an intersect on these, we would expect 0 rows to be returned because there's nothing in this table that should exist in this table and vice versa. And essentially that's what we find. So this is going to be the union, the except, and the intersect that we just did. But remember, the union and the intersect exist in Oracle, but instead of the except, we have the minus.